start off by explaining, how does a company that makes $45 billion need a bailout compared to other industries?
It's a very good question. They don't, arguably, right? But I think the oil companies have generally gotten used to getting what they want because they have, right? For 150 years, for the full duration of their existence, and that's a big part of why they become literally the most profitable companies in human history and history of money, right? Um, so they don't need the money, but they can get it. Um, and governments of every stripe have been giving it to them. But arguably, they should be dipping into their own coffers now in a situation like this. How would we go about it? I mean, my preference over the short term would actually be to start by kind of regulating the shit out of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that would include things like capping their production, right, and constraining their ability through regulation to keep exploring and keep digging, and cutting their subsidies as well, for instance. And what that would do is that would really knock down their valuation, right? And then once their values have collapsed, you can buy them up cheap, right? Because even now, like the valuation of oil companies, it's really perverse. It's basically based on all the profit that they might make if they can fully exploit the reserves they have on the books, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which of course is insane because oil companies have 5 times more on their books than we can safely burn if we want to keep global warming within safe limits, right? Um, so already these companies are like, their market valuation is way too high. So we can figure out ways to knock them down. And there've been examples of precedents, like in California, for instance, there was a bill that actually isn't going through anymore, but it was going to ban drilling for oil companies within a certain distance from like homes and hospitals and schools. And what was interesting is that when that was on the table, immediately oil and gas companies' prices started collapsing, the ones that were going to be involved in the state. So basically, once you've knocked down their value, then you can buy them up cheap, right? And I have a friend who works at Oil Change International, which is a great kind of progressive oil analyst group. She actually did a kind of back of the napkin calculation on what it would cost right now to take a controlling share in Canada's oil and gas sector. And basically, it's $50 billion right now. You could have a controlling share in the whole oil and gas sector. And
Wow.
just to put that in perspective, like, that's not that much. Like
That's
Zoom,
one
right?
fifth of the bailout they're asking for right now.
Right. And like,
Yeah.
she pointed out that Zoom, right, which is the video conferencing company that some of us who aren't as plugged into the Discord world, um, uh, are having to rely on now, that Zoom has a total market value that is greater than the top 7 Canadian oil and gas exploration and production companies combined right now.
Wow.
So we could knock that down even further, then take a controlling share. Um, and at that point, over the medium to long term, we could begin to organize a kind of managed decline of the oil and gas sector, using the profits for funding a renewable energy transition, for conservation initiatives, and then move them eventually toward liquidation. And obviously, I'd like to eventually, as we saw, with Bernie Sanders' platform as well, eventually putting oil execs on trial, right? And sending them to the Hague, but that's a bit further down the line.
No, you're getting radical.
All right. Well, but the thing is that it's not even a very radical
Oh, I don't
proposition.
think so. But I mean,
In
you're on a lefty show right now, right? Like
Right, right,
if
right.
you were to
Yeah.
propose that on, I don't know where you appear, like CNN, MSNBC, things like that, and you were like, we should hold these companies accountable because they're killing all of us. They'll be like, well, they're also keeping you warm, don't you? You like being warm, don't you? Prefer to be warm than being cold, right? Like,
But what's interesting too is I think a lot of people think that that people outside the radical left think that this is like Looney Tunes, but in fact, like the few times that pollsters have actually asked Canadians what they think, like the last time a poll was done nationally in Canada was 2005, and half of Canadians thought public ownership was the right thing to do, right?
nice.
Um, it's not like people in Canada or the US don't like their schools and their buses and the libraries being run as part of the public sector, right? It makes a lot of sense. And we have a history in Canada as well of that kind of nationalization, right? So like it's kind of ironic historically because in the 1970s it was Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau,
Mhm.
who actually began nationalizing the oil sector in Canada, right? Um, and most of us have a very, I think, most Canadians have a very skewed um, understanding of this period because it's refracted in the through the prism of an incredible amount of propaganda from the corporate media and oil companies. But in the 1970s, Canada bought an oil company and had a crown oil company corporation called Petro Canada, and then brought in a bunch of policies that basically took way more profits from oil companies, kept oil prices lower across Canada, helped with oil conservation, and basically operated as a kind of internal spy within the oil sector. And what was interesting at the time is oil companies actually did secret polling that showed that 80% of Canadians supported this, and including 50% of people in Alberta, right?
Wow.
Um, but Trudeau Senior kind of made some mistakes. He kind of overreached in jurisdiction, and it kind of allowed. And then there was a global oil downturn in the 70s, the OPEC crisis, and that hit oil producing countries around the world. And so, kind of the corporate elite in this country and the mainstream media jumped on that, and they totally smeared those policies. So they, they engaged in a whole bunch of red baiting. Like they nicknamed Petro Canada's headquarters in Calgary Red Square. Um, and like they pretended to drive their rigs across the border to show the kind of flight that would happen. And so they did a
When
kind
did
of
we sell it off to Suncor then? Because that's like I grew up thinking that the oil industries in Canada were all private corporations, right? Like Suncor basically owns all of us now.
no, like just as with most industrial developments now that are hugely or monopolies that are hugely profitable, like Suncor, Syncrude wouldn't have got off the ground were it not for huge amounts of federal subsidies and federal research and development support through the 60s and early 70s. um, Petrocan then eventually, so basically what happened is uh, when Brian Mulroney came into power, one of his first tasks was to do the bidding of the oil companies and dismantle the National Energy Program, which was this program of beginning the nationalization, and then eventually Petro Canada was also kind of sold off through the 80s and 90s. And like the pretty much the only thing that Canadians now remember often about that period is the kind of bumper sticker that became popular in Alberta at the time, which was "Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark." But what's unfortunate is that it was popular in Alberta as well because it made sense. People were getting more money in their pocket. Oil was cheaper in Canada, and people really loved the fact that we were, flipping the bird at the U.S. like Ronald Reagan was stewing, but they
Mm.
ultimately couldn't do anything, which was interesting. Like the oil companies did a bunch of kind of uh, secret kind of convenings, and they were like, "Look, we can't fight back against this because it's just so damn popular." So they lucked out with that oil downturn, but um, Justin Trudeau's dad was on the right path. The problem was that he just didn't go far enough, right? Um, and so I think we're in a moment now where, with oil prices just crashing,
Yeah, I was going
with
to bring that up. Like, I mean,
yeah,
and
with
that
a
has a lot to do with like global economies crashing simultaneously. But the price of oil, I think OPEC decided before they disbanded to drop it significantly, right?
Yeah, and the thing is you have now like a lot of low cost oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia and like Russia really trying to get ahead of the curve, right? Because investors are starting to pull out of oil across the board, but in particular, that what that's doing is that's leaving a lot of extreme oil or unconventional oil supplies like the Alberta tar sands looking like pretty shitty investments, right? So you've seen this like outflow of tons of international investment in the tar sands in the last few years. Um, and so the good days are not coming back
Is
really
that is
to
that
Alberta.
universal worldwide right now? That like big investors are pulling out of the oil and gas energy sector? Is that
Well,
is that a sign of the
well,
times?
they're pulling out of unconventional oil. So, for instance, stuff that's really expensive and very high carbon, like the tar sands, right?
Or fracking?
Fracking has its own problems.
Mm-hmm.
Um, exploration in the Arctic also, people started pulling out of that because it was just so expensive, right? So a lot of the majors are really trying to push out the low, the kind of sweet crude, right? The conventional cheap oil, and that's putting places like Alberta in a very tough spot. So if anything, prospects for nationalization in the coming months and years are much better than they ever have been. And I think it could be done. Um, uh, and when we talk about nationalization, I think a lot of people have in mind like the kind of big nationalized projects of old, right? Which are like highly centralized, top down, often very corrupt, very bureaucratic. But these could also be opportunities to reinvent nationalization, right? Like we could have nonprofits owned by all levels of government or even by cooperatives, right? And people in Canada, I don't know how, in the States as much, but people in Canada have experience, millions of Canadians have experiences with cooperatives, right? We generally like cooperatives. And you could hardwire these crown corporations or nonprofits basically to commit to ease us off oil, right? Rather than trying to sell us every last fucking drop.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't be run by CEOs who are accountable just to shareholders and who want to maximize profits, but they could involve boards with elected representatives of workers, consumers, First Nations. I mean, that was the other major flaw with that program of initial nationalization in the 70s under Trudeau Sr. is that it completely ignored the rights of Indigenous peoples. So that would have to
No surprise
change.
there. That seems
No
business as
surprise
usual
there.
for
And that
Canada.
continued. Yeah. And you're seeing that too, right? Like under the kind of cover of coronavirus, you're seeing kind of colonialism continue to push projects on Indigenous people's land. So, we have seen, LNG Canada, against whom there was a huge amount of resistance just a month ago, right? It feels like ages ago,
Years
but
ago. You're talking about the Wet'suwet'en
um,
people?
yeah, exactly. When
Yeah.
there was a blockades against um, this liquefied natural gas project from being pushed through. And then there was solidarity blockades that sprung up across the country. What you're now seeing is, these man camps, so-called man camps, which are basically just like these like packed villages of, as many workers as 1,000 to 2,000, often flown in from all across Canada, uh, haven't been closed, right? So apparently, like all non-essential uh, uh, sites and um, uh, businesses have been closed, and in BC, all gatherings above 50 have been banned. But somehow, LNG man camp with hundreds and hundreds of workers still flying in is somehow an essential service.
Mm-hmm.
So colonial theft never sleeps, and it takes all opportunities to push through its plans. So that's a disturbing sign, and it's
How
going to be
I was going to ask, is this possible in the US, or is the oil sector there just too powerful to ever be played with?
nationalization. No, I mean, I, I think equally there. Like when you're looking at the sums of money being discussed for bailouts, or even just think of the $1 trillion that got spent as a tax giveaway to the corporate elite in the states. Like no, you see the same dynamics unfolding in the states where you know the with the oil price crash, like these buying a controlling stake in these companies is going to become very possible. It's really just a question of political will, and of us like building that kind of political power. And I think I was tremendously excited by Bernie Sanders' campaign and the kind of movement that was backing him. And I think it was putting a lot of these kinds of demands. For instance, Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal had public ownership of energy companies and private utilities um, uh, as part of its program. So I think in many ways this has become much more um, you know, tangible and politically palatable and realizable for a lot of people in a way that it wasn't, 5, 10 years ago.
Hey you, yes, you. Do you like cozy environments with other wholesome people? Well then come join the Discord. It's got a whole bunch of stuff to help you with creative endeavors, such as stock footage, royalty-free music, and an amazing community of people looking to help each other out and uplift your content. Join the Discord now by going to weareserfs.com. That's weareserfs.com.
We would like to thank Miranda Marone. You are our monarch, and we thank you for our indentured servitude. We would like to thank our lords, Ricky Pilgrim, I'm Raft, Michaela Schmid, Tomospin, Ferrer Tajon. You are all the pillars of our organization. To our Knights of the Square Table, Paul Parafit, Daniel Kahn, Clement Chutskoff, Alan R., Josh Mickelson, and Dr. Zayas, Dr. Zayas, Cooper Pilot, Andrea Lynn Epperly, Dylan Bythe, Terry, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. And to our merchants, thank you for taking mercy upon us.